All right, thanking God for the way in which he actually welcomes us insofar as we approach him with good motives. Understanding that, let's call this one dinner. Not that that relates to having good motives, but I think by the time we get to the end of the chapter, we will see the way in which, as we've seen in Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel, there will be a growing division in Israel that has a lot to do with their motives, all brought to a conclusion by a dinner conversation that he has at the end of the chapter. That is actually going to revisit another low-key issue we have mentioned before, and that is the way that I've noticed, at least more in Luke's gospel, the way in which he is not only healing people with physical ailments or difficult or disturbed spirits, he is reconciling them in the way that he is willing to touch those that might otherwise be considered untouchable. That seemed to be a thing in chapter 7, where in the first 10 verses, he is going to heal a centurion's servant by not so much touching him. In the famous story that we saw back in, I think it was Matthew chapter 8. Luke's version is likewise going to show the centurion, this time sending elders of Israel who are going to vouch for him as one who actually loves the people of Israel and even more has built a synagogue for them. Them persuading Jesus that he is worthy. Jesus on the way to his house is going to be stopped by some other envoys or messengers that he sends to say, I'm not worthy for you to come into my house, but I am fully convinced that if you say the word, my servant will be healed, understanding that I am a man under authority who also has people under my authority. And when I tell them to go or to come, they respond. And he fully believes that Jesus' servant will respond merely at his word, at which point Jesus is going to marvel at the man's faith, saying he has not seen that level of faith even in Israel. And accordingly, he is going to heal the centurion's servant without so much as touching him, only with basically, I think, the level of faith shown. Understanding that verses 11 through 17 are going to give us a contrast because he is going to raise a widow's son who is actually already in the coffin. And as he passes by, he is going to touch the coffin, causing the young man to arise, restoring the young man to his mother alive. Understanding that back in the law, death was one of the things that was most defiling. And so touching a dead body or the things that a dead body had touched can actually make you ceremonially unclean or unclean under the law. But Christ is not so much using this as an act of defiance to the law as he has already been accused of in violating potentially the Sabbath laws when he's really only violating their interpretation of the Sabbath laws. What he is helping them to understand is not that he is violating God's law regarding the uncleanness of death, but he is actually restoring the man to life, removing the stain of death. Understanding that by the touch of the coffin, he is basically restoring the young man to life. By the end of the chapter, we're going to see it's not only physical touch it's not only physical touch that seems to be an issue, but the way in which the great things that he has done is actually touching the hearts of many. Understanding that by the time we get to verse 16, it's going to say a great prophet has arisen among us and God has visited his people. Meaning that all the things that have happened up to this point are at least opening some of the people's eyes to the point that this really could be the Messiah. Understanding that, however, there are still going to be those who are untouched or whose hearts are going to be untouched by the things that they have seen. Surprisingly enough, it's going to be maybe in the form of some of John's disciples, beginning in verse 18, going on from verses 18 on through 35. It's not so much that they are untouched, but they still have doubts. And we're going to get a chance to see the way in which Jesus is not condemning, merely questioning or being uncertain about what they're seeing in him. But by the time we get to the end of that section, he is going to go further to talk about those who are seemingly willfully blind, meaning they don't want their hearts to be touched either by what they're seeing in John, understanding that John came to them in what we would call austerity. He is depriving himself of the full privileges he has under God's law. Christ, on the other hand, seems to be coming in a more full version of the liberty that he has in God, saying that he's coming eating and drinking, whereas John came doing neither, and they still aren't satisfied either by what they see in John or Jesus, leaving us to basically conclude that they simply are rejecting God. Going on in verses 36 and forward. Let me pause right there saying that is my paraphrase of the situation. But it goes back to what we saw in God's relationship with Moses. When Moses was being rejected by the people, he is going to encourage Moses by saying, they are not rejecting you because you are actually serving me. They're rejecting me because of the things that you were doing on my behalf. Understanding that both John and Jesus were great representations of the work that God had for them to do, it's quite likely that the people are representing the way in which, no matter what form they get it in a form of austerity or a form of freedom, they're just rejecting God's servants, as is going to say they've had a history of doing going back to the days of the prophets. With verses 36 on through the end of the chapter, giving us another extension on that whole concept of beyond touching hearts, the way he uses physical touch to restore those who, in some ways, were lacking in Israel. Understanding it tells the story of the sinful woman who was being forgiven as that whole concept of dinner comes to the fore. As verse 36 will read, one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. Going on to show how the Pharisee who hosted him thought that if this man knew what kind of woman this was, he wouldn't allow her to touch him, at which point Jesus, understanding what he was thinking, is going to tell the famous story of two folks who were forgiven, one a great debt, one a lesser debt, at which point he asks the Pharisee, who do you think loves more, the one forgiven much or the one forgiven little? At which point the Pharisee accurately says, the one forgiven more, I'm guessing, will love more. At which point Jesus will make the point that she has shown him more affection than Simon the Pharisee did, even as his host, helping him to understand that it is not so much the status in life that Christ is worried about as much as we mentioned before, the motives of the individual. Understanding that this woman was motivated by her forgiveness to show gratitude, even in a situation where it might have been considered humiliating. And so in a conversation over dinner with one of the Pharisees, we're getting the chance to see the way in which God, or the Christ, is willing to touch those who are considered outcasts in the society, even as in the next chapter, he is going to begin to create distance between himself and those, including more and more of the Pharisees, using parables, as we have acknowledged, stories with a deeper meaning that not everyone gets, especially if they're not coming to him with healthy motives. As over the course of two additional dinners with the Pharisees, one in chapter 11 and another in chapter 14, we will get to see Jesus make it plain why he considers their motives to be untrustworthy. But as we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. That God give us the wisdom not only to look beyond the surface or the status an individual might have to have a better appreciation of their motives. May he likewise help us to find wise ways to put distance between ourselves and unhealthy motives.